This video is brought to you by Magellan TV. Take advantage of a month-long free trial of Magellan TV and discover a new type of content experience with its binge-worthy documentaries and non-fiction series. More on them in a bit. On December the 10th, 1989, at Oslo City Hall in Norway, Yevgeny Pasternak was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature on behalf of his late father, Boris Pasternak, who 31 years prior was nominated for the contentious and now infamous novel Dr. ZHIVAGO. He was forced to decline the award at the behest of Soviet authorities, who had banned the publication of the book just 2 years earlier, threatening him with exile should he accept it. The book's publication, in hands with the Nobel Prize nomination, though contested, sparked one of the greatest cultural storms of the Cold War. You see, Soviet authorities deplored Dr. ZHIVAGO for its critical portrayal of the Russian Revolution and its raw depictions of brutality under the Soviet regime, though most feared of all was its thought-provoking nature. In order to preserve the integrity of Communist Party rhetoric, Soviet censors went to extreme lengths to ban any literary text that dared to question the regime or challenge Soviet ideology. Cultural corruption was perhaps the greatest plight that threatened to unravel the threads of the Soviet system. Western intelligence agencies were blatantly aware of the potentially devastating effects that such invasive ideals, like those pertaining to Western ideas of free speech or democracy, could wreak on Stalin's totalitarian regime, and so they conceived an audacious plan to smuggle Dr. ZHIVAGO, as well as other blacklisted books, into the hands of the Soviet citizenry. Today, recently classified CIA documents detail how Western intelligence agencies conducted a series of covert operations between 1952 and 1959. Their goal? To sow the seeds of dissidence amid the fields of Soviet hearts and minds. This is how American, British, and Dutch intelligence infiltrated the Iron Curtain and waged a covert war against the USSR, not with tanks or fighter jets, but with literature. Now, if I were to ask you what was the defining event of the Cold War, what would you say? You might think of the space race, or Checkpoint Charlie, or perhaps the Cuban Missile Crisis. While just footnotes in history today, each of these events came within just a few degrees of heating the Cold War above a temperature of no return. Given that a hot war would result in a global nuclear Armageddon, open conflict gave way to the battle for ideological supremacy as the US and USSR fought to assert their cultural, intellectual, and artistic dominance over the other. Over the course of 5 years, from 1952 to 1957, from 3 sites in West Germany, a CIA operation codenamed Aedinosaur launched hundreds of thousands of 10-foot balloons carrying copies of George Orwell's Animal Farm into Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The letters AE in the name designated a Soviet-Russian division, and the word dinosaur was just a randomly generated cryptogram. Now you might be wondering, well, what could the US possibly hope to achieve by airdropping books into Soviet territory? Well, for this to make sense, it's first important to understand the contents of Orwell's novel. For those who are unfamiliar, Animal Farm is a satirical novel that tells the story of a group of farm animals who rebel against their human farmer master, hoping to create a utopian society where all animals can be equal, free, and happy. I actually very recently reread Animal Farm since the first time I was a kid. It's a great read. If you haven't read it, give it a go. Judging a book by its cover, you might believe Orwell's 1945 novel to be an innocent work of children's literature. Not the one I read. It's pretty dark on the front. But make no mistake, this was not Clifford the Big Red Dog, nor the Very Hungry Caterpillar. The underlying premise is symbolic of Russia and the Soviet Union under the Communist Party, and a metaphorical representation of the events that led up to the Russian Revolution. Many of the anthropomorphic characters represent the key historical figures of the era. For instance, the early protagonist, a pig named Old Major, represents a combination of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. Later, he's replaced by a fierce-looking Berkshire boar inspired by the Russian dictator Joseph Stalin. Mr. Jones, the incompetent and oppressive farmer and the ruler of Manor Farm, is based on Tsar Nicholas II, who's overthrown by the animals of his farm, who represent Bolshevik and liberal revolutionaries. Alright, so more broadly speaking, Animal Farm is just representative of all sectors of human society, be it capitalist, communist, socialist, or fascist. Though, like countless other novels that were critical of the Soviet system, it was swiftly banned under the pretense of protecting Stalin's reputation and preserving the integrity of communism. So, back to our book-carrying balloons. As you might imagine, Soviet authorities ordered these 10-foot balloons to be shot down by the air forces of the respective satellite states of the Eastern Bloc and their Orwellian payloads to be destroyed. However, despite the Soviet Union's best efforts to intercept and destroy as many of these balloons as possible, literally thousands of copies successfully infiltrated the Iron Curtain and did as the CIA intended, finding their way into the hands of Soviet intelligentsia and spreading from person to person like an intellectual contagion, causing those exposed to question their rulers and the ideology in ways that they'd never dared to before. But in the same breath, Soviet censorship wasn't a joke, and for every citizen bold enough to peer beyond the veil of state-approved media, there were hundreds more for whom the thought of reprisal would deter even the slightest transgression. However, this censor state long predates the Bolsheviks' rise to power, adapted primarily from the pre-existing, pre-revolutionary censorship model. In the words of Estonian professor and author Pavel Reifman, Soviet censorship did not come out of nowhere. It was the successor of the pre-revolutionary Russian censorship, the censorship of a centuries-old autocratic Russia. Following the February Revolution and the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, the Russian provisional government eliminated the main center of Tsarist censorship, the main committee on matters of the press, and they introduced the post of COMMISSAR on matters of the press. This new institution, for which we generally associate the Cold War Soviet censorship model today, comprised several different branches. The Goskommissariat was the state committee for publishing in the Soviet Union, responsible for all printed materials such as fiction, poetry, and novellas. The Goskino, the abbreviated name for the USSR State Committee for Cinematography, and that was in charge of, well, you guessed it, cinema. The Gostelradio was in charge of, again, you guessed it, radio and television broadcasting, while the first department was responsible for ensuring that state secrets and other sensitive information only reached authorized hands. The Soviet government implemented a policy of mass destruction of pre-revolutionary and foreign books. Items that were deemed politically incorrect or socially harmful were uprooted from libraries all around the USSR. Special collections, or Specskran, were compilations of censored library text only accessible to those granted a special permit by the KGB. With the Soviet government's brutal display of disdain towards the old literary world, you can surely imagine how many of the Soviet Union's best and brightest writers would ultimately bend to the will of the state, casting aside artistic freedoms and embracing the confines of socialist realism. Now, just before we continue with today's video, let me tell you about today's wonderful sponsor, Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a new documentary streaming service founded by filmmakers who love history. Their mission is to tell the great stories that have defined the human experience. And with more than 3,000 amazing programs on Magellan, it's hard to stop watching once you start. They've got everything from the Greeks to the Great War, plus modern history, biographies, scientific profiles, true crime, and so much more. And their team adds more content every single week. And what's one thing you love about paid streaming services? Of course, there are no ads, just lots and lots of great content. I'd recommend checking out Battlefields of the World Wars. If you enjoy the videos that we do on this channel, that's probably going to be right up your street. Right now, you guys can get a 1-month free trial of Magellan by clicking the link in the description below. It's content for days and days, so let Magellan hook you up. You'll be glad you did. And now back to today's video. While there were many writers and intellectuals who resisted the draconian measures imposed upon them, there's arguably none more renowned than Boris Leonovich Pasternak. Born on February 10, 1890, to a prominent Jewish family in Moscow, he was exposed to a culturally rich background from an early age. His father, Leonid, was an artist, and his mother, Rosa, a pianist. Boris studied musical composition for 6 years at the prestigious Moscow University, though by 1912 had renounced music as his life's calling and abruptly left for Germany, where he studied philosophy at the University of Marburg for a semester in 1913. Young Boris displayed promise as an articulate and insightful writer, having already begun translating the works of Rilke by the age of 19, publishing his first book, a compilation of poetry titled Lyrics, in 1913, followed by A Twin in the Clouds just a year later. These academic endeavors exposed Boris to an exclusive world of Russian intellectualism, even from a very early age. Shortly after his birth, Pasternak's parents had joined the Tolstoyan movement, named after the novelist Leo Tolstoy, author of War and Peace, and a close family friend. As Pasternak recalled, "My father illustrated his books, went to see him, revered him, and the whole house was imbued with his spirit." Now, what follows is arguably the most turbulent era in all of Russian history, an era that would go on to inspire Pasternak's most notable and influential work of fiction, Dr. Zhivago. The outbreak of World War I devastated an already ravaged Russian nation. Widespread economic inflation and dire food shortages bred discontent and social unrest among a vast population whose dissolution with the ruling class was set to reach a bit of a crescendo. The February Revolution of 1917 saw the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II from power and the installation of a provisional Russian government, one which was then overthrown by Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution, better known as the October Revolution, which exploded later that very same year. Now, to briefly sum up the contents of Pasternak's novel, the protagonist of Dr. Zhivago, Dr. Yuri Zhivago, is a poet, a philosopher, physician, and alter ego of Pasternak, who's torn between his love for two women, his own wife, Olga, and the wife of a Soviet revolutionary named Lara, all while navigating the socio-political turmoil of 20th century Russia. The novel is set between the Russian Revolution of 1905 and the conclusion of World War II. In the story, his life is ultimately changed by the First World War and the outbreak of the Russian Revolution. Due to Yuri's occupation as a doctor, he serves as a frontline medic on the Eastern Front of the First World War. It's here that he encounters firsthand the devastating effects of industrialized warfare. When the 1917 revolution erupts, the war ends for Russia, and Zhivago and his family flee Moscow for the Urals, at which point they become caught up in the Russian Civil War. Here, again, Yuri serves as a medic alongside a group of partisan soldiers, utilizing the narrative to vividly depict the innumerable atrocities and barbarous acts that stain the era. In addition to the graphic depictions of violence, brutality, and unflattering, often raw accounts of early 20th century Russia, Dr. Zhivago features depictions of sex and is seen by some as glorifying adultery and promiscuity. Basically, these things are a bit of a no-go if your goal is to publish the novel in the Soviet Union. When Pasternak attempted to do just that and submitted Dr. Zhivago for publication in 1956, the Goskomsomol, the state printing and publishing agency, outright refused. This was due to its perceived anti-Soviet sentiment and its rejection of socialist realism, not least to mention the subtle criticisms of Stalinism, collectivization, the Great Purge, and the Gulag system, because who would want to criticize any of those things? So, with no hope of publication in his native Russia, Pasternak sent several Russian-language copies of the manuscript of Dr. Zhivago to a number of Western contacts, one of whom was an influential Italian publisher called Gian Giacomo Feltrinelli, who shortly thereafter arranged for the novel to be smuggled out of the Soviet Union by Sergio D'Angelo. D'Angelo was a member of the Italian Communist Party who worked with Radio Moscow on Italian-language programming. As such, he didn't need to venture far outside of the city when in 1956 he traveled southwest by train to visit Pasternak personally at his dacha in the Soviet-made writers' colony Peredilkino. Here, he met the now 66-year-old poet and requested a copy of his novel, to which Pasternak handed him a newspaper-wrapped package. Inside was the almost 800 typewritten page manuscript for Dr. Zhivago, including Pasternak's own handwritten revisions. Upon handing over the manuscript, Pasternak is quoted as saying, "You are hereby invited to watch me face the firing squad." Despite Pasternak's desire for Dr. Zhivago to see the light of day, D'Angelo's request to smuggle his work out of the Soviet Union and publish it externally risked severe repercussions for the author. Following Stalin's death in 1953, cultural prohibitions were beginning to loosen, but the threat of vicious reprisals continued to linger. Should the external publishing of Dr. Zhivago come to the attention of the Soviet authorities, Pasternak could be labeled a traitor of the state and executed in a similar fashion to that of Boris Pilnyak, Pasternak's former next-door neighbor, who less than 20 years prior had been executed for violating the party's literary commands, specifically pertaining to the rumored publication of a novel outside of the USSR. Now, despite these reservations, Pasternak gave D'Angelo his blessing to publish Dr. Zhivago under Feltrinelli, and despite desperate efforts to prevent its publication by the Union of Soviet Writers, the first Italian-language editions rolled off the printing press in 1957. So immense was the desire for Dr. Zhivago that Feltrinelli was able to license translation rights for 18 different languages far in advance of the novel's publication. While certain details are still shrouded in mystery to this very day, the CIA released over 100 declassified documents in 2014 pertaining to their MI6's and Dutch intelligence's involvement in the large-scale publishing of Pasternak's novel. It's believed that an unnamed British intelligence officer managed to procure a copy of the manuscript for Dr. Zhivago and photographed its contents page by page before delivering it to American intelligence services. A CIA memo dated January 2, 1958 states, "Forwarded herewith are 2 rolls of film, which are negatives of the photocopy of Dr. Zhivago by Pasternak. They have been given to us by Redacted, who requested they be returned in due course." Following this, an internal CIA memo to all branch chiefs of the agency's Soviet Russia division, monitored by CIA Director Alan Dulles and sanctioned by President Dwight D. Eisenhower's Operation Coordinating Board, reveals their initial thoughts on Pasternak's novel and how they might use it as a tool of propaganda against the Soviets. And that memo reads as such: "This book has great propaganda value not only for its intrinsic message and thought-provoking nature, but also for the circumstances of its publication. We have the opportunity to make Soviet citizens wonder what is wrong with their government when a fine literary work by the man acknowledged to be the greatest living Russian writer is not even available in his own country, in his own language, for his own people to read." Having successfully obtained a copy of Pasternak's manuscript, the CIA began exploring all viable options for the discreet publication of the Russian-language edition of Dr. Zhivago. After considering a secret printing of the novel through a small New York publisher, the CIA conducted the Dutch intelligence service BVD and arranged for the printing of 1,000 blue linen hardcover copies at the Muten Publishers of The Hague in early September 1958. American and Dutch intelligence were closely tied, having cooperated throughout the Second World War against the occupying forces of Nazi Germany. CIA subsidies in 1958 paid for approximately 50 of the BVD's 691 staff members, with new Dutch employees receiving special training in Washington. Joop van der Walden, a BVD officer, was dispatched to the US Embassy at The Hague to discuss the printing with Walter CINI, a CIA operator stationed there at the time. CINI told him that it would be a rush job, but the CIA was willing to provide the manuscript and paid generously for a small print run of Dr. Zhivago. He emphasized that there should be no trace of involvement by the US or any other intelligence agency. As such, the 1,000 Russian-language copies printed by Muten Publishers contained numerous typos and truncated storylines, not least to mention its perceived illegality, as the publishing rights for Pasternak's novel belonged exclusively to Italian publisher Feltrinelli. The main target for distribution was the 1958 Brussels Universal and International Exhibition, the first post-war World Fair, where among scores of international visitors, several thousand Soviets of Russian and Eastern European descent were permitted to partake in the exhibition. Dr. Zhivago could not be handed out at the US Pavilion at the World's Fair, but the CIA had a convenient ally nearby: the Vatican. Russian emigre Catholics had set up a small library just off the pavilion's Chapel of Silence, a place to reflect on the suppression of Christian communities around the world. It was here, behind shrouded curtains, that the CIA-sponsored edition of Dr. Zhivago was discreetly pressed into the hands of visiting Soviet citizens. Accounts of what transpired recalled in Peter Finn's The Zhivago Affair, the Kremlin, the CIA, and the battle over a forbidden book. Quote, Soon the book's blue linen covers were found littering the fairgrounds. Some who got the novel were ripping off the cover, dividing the pages, and stuffing them into their pockets to make the book easier to hide. It was hoped that some would take the book home and circulate it among their friends, some of whom might copy it in the form of Samizdat, clandestine, often handwritten or typed copies of state-banned literature, to expose copies of the novel to an even wider group of people. An internal CIA memo dated September 10, 1958 states, "This phase can be considered completed successfully." There was, however, one glaring problem. The CIA had anticipated that the Dutch publisher would sign a contract with Feltrinelli, Pasternak's Milan publisher, and that the books handed out in Brussels would be considered part of that print run. The contract, however, was never officially signed, and the Russian-language edition, printed in The Hague, was illegal. The Italian publisher, who held the rights to Dr. Zhivago, was infuriated upon learning about the distribution of the novel in Brussels. The fallout from such a debacle sparked press interest and rumors about the CIA's involvement, and though unconfirmed at the time, it risked exposing the entire operation. To avoid letting the cat out of the proverbial bag in any future operations, the CIA's Soviet Russia division opted to internalize the production of Dr. Zhivago and arranged for the printing of 9,000 miniature copies at a subsidiary Washington print house. Pasternak's Nobel Prize nomination in November of that same year further emboldened the CIA's efforts. Despite politically motivated attacks on Pasternak in Moscow and his vilification by Soviet authorities, the next opportunity presented itself at the 1959 World Festival of Youth and Students for Peace and Friendship in Vienna, where 2,000 copies were set aside for distribution among an entourage of visiting Soviet students. This time, the book was not only available, but largely unavoidable. When a Soviet convoy of buses arrived in Vienna, swarms of Russian emigres tossed copies of the CIA's miniature edition through the open windows. On another occasion, a Soviet visitor to the youth festival recalled returning to his bus and finding the cabin covered with pocket editions of Dr. Zhivago. Throughout the festival, Soviet students were shadowed by the presence of KGB officers who fooled no one when describing themselves as researchers. However, they proved to be more tolerant than one might have expected, with one observer quoted as saying, "Take it, read it, but by no means bring it home." Despite formally declining the 1958 Nobel Prize nomination, the Union of Soviet Writers denounced Pasternak as a traitor and lobbied to have him exiled to the West. In response, Pasternak wrote directly to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, pleading, "Leaving the motherland will mean equal death for me. I am tied to Russia by birth, by life, and work." As a result of this and the intercession of the Indian Prime Minister, Pasternak was subsequently spared exile from his homeland. Dr. Zhivago was finally published in Russia in 1987 as part of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's democratic reforms. This came just 4 years before the fall of the USSR. Boris Pasternak died of lung cancer in his dacha in Peredelkino on the evening of May 30th, 1960. Though deceased, his humanistic legacy and advocacy of artistic freedom in the face of adversity and persecution is one as timeless and as relevant today as during the era of his own suppression. Despite the ever-looming dangers that shadowed his every move, Pasternak stood firm in his beliefs, and in doing so defined himself as a bastion of artistic freedom whose plight inspired numerous generations with his defiant nature that, to this day, is a sobering reminder of the struggle for freedom that so many faced and continue to face for as long as tyrannical regimes are left unquestioned. So I do hope you found today's video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.